How to obtain a U.S. tax identification number as a non-resident Canadian rental property owner. Non-residents who own rental properties in Canada may need to obtain a United States tax identification number, TIN, in order to comply with U.S. tax laws. This is because rental income earned by non-residents is subject to U.S. tax under certain circumstances. In this article, we will explore how non-residents can obtain a U.S. TIN if they own a rental property in Canada. The process of obtaining a U.S. TIN can be confusing and time-consuming, especially for non-residents. However, it is important to ensure that you are in compliance with U.S. tax laws to avoid penalties and other consequences. This article will provide a step-by-step guide on how to obtain a U.S. TIN as a non-resident who owns a rental property in Canada, including the necessary forms and documentation required. Understanding tax identification numbers. A tax identification number, TIN, is a unique identifier assigned by the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, to individuals and entities for tax purposes. The TIN is used to identify taxpayers and facilitate the processing of tax returns and payments. For non-resident individuals who own rental property in Canada, obtaining a TIN is necessary to comply with U.S. tax laws. The TIN is required to report rental income, claim deductions, and file tax returns with the IRS. There are different types of TINs that can be obtained depending on the individual's status and the purpose of the TIN. The most common types of TINs are the Social Security Number, SSN, and the Individual Taxpayer Identification Number, ITIN. The SSN is a 9-digit number assigned to U.S. citizens, permanent residents, and certain non-immigrants who are authorized to work in the U.S. The ITIN is a 9-digit number assigned to individuals who are not eligible for an SSN but have a tax filing requirement. To obtain an ITIN, non-resident individuals must complete Form W-7 and submit it to the IRS along with supporting documents such as a valid passport. The processing time for an ITIN application can take up to 11 weeks, so it is important to apply well in advance of the tax filing deadline. In summary, non-resident individuals who own rental property in Canada must obtain a TIN to comply with U.S. tax laws. The most common types of TINs are the SSN and the ITIN. And the ITIN can be obtained by completing Form W-7 and submitting it to the IRS. Why non-residents need a U.S. tax identification number? Non-residents who own rental property in Canada and receive rental income from U.S. sources are required to obtain a U.S. tax identification number, TIN. A TIN is a unique 9-digit number that the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, uses to identify taxpayers who are required to file tax returns and pay taxes. The IRS requires non-residents to obtain a TIN because they are subject to U.S. tax laws and must file U.S. tax returns. Non-residents who fail to obtain a TIN may face penalties and interest on unpaid taxes. Obtaining a TIN is a simple process that can be done online or by mail. Non-residents can apply for a TIN by completing Form W-7 and submitting it to the IRS along with the required documentation. The IRS will then issue a TIN within 4 to 6 weeks. In summary, non-residents who own rental property in Canada and receive rental income from U.S. sources are required to obtain a U.S. tax identification number. Failure to obtain a TIN may result in penalties and interest on unpaid taxes. Obtaining a TIN is a simple process that can be done online or by mail. Owning rental property in Canada as a non-resident. If you are a non-resident of Canada and own a rental property in the country, you may be wondering how to obtain a USA tax identification number. This number is necessary for reporting rental income earned in Canada to the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, in the United States. The first step in obtaining a USA tax identification number is to apply for an Individual Taxpayer Identification Number, ITIN, with the IRS. Non-residents can apply for an ITIN by completing Form W-7 and submitting it to the IRS along with the required documents. In addition to obtaining a USA tax identification number, non-resident owners of rental property in Canada must also comply with Canadian tax laws. This includes filing a Canadian income tax return and paying any taxes owed to the Canada Revenue Agency, CRA. It is important to note that non-resident owners of rental property in Canada may also be subject to withholding tax on rental income earned in the country. This tax is deducted at the source by the tenant or property manager and remitted to the CRA. Overall, owning rental property in Canada as a non-resident requires compliance with both Canadian and U.S. tax laws. Obtaining a USA tax identification number is just one step in this process. Steps to obtain a U.S. tax identification number. If you are a non-resident who owns a rental property in Canada and needs a U.S. tax identification number, TIN, you can follow these steps to obtain one. Complete Form W-7. To apply for a TIN, you need to fill out Form W-7, which is the application for IRS Individual Taxpayer Identification Number. You can download this form from the IRS website or request a copy by mail. Gather required documents. You will need to provide certain documents to verify your identity and foreign status. These may include a valid passport, national ID card, or other government-issued identification. Submit your application. Once you have completed Form W-7 and gathered the necessary documents, you can submit your application to the IRS. You can do this by mail or in person at an IRS Taxpayer Assistance Center. Wait for processing. It may take several weeks for the IRS to process your application and issue your TIN. Once you receive your TIN, you can use it to file your U.S. tax returns and fulfill your tax obligations. It is important to note that obtaining a TIN does not necessarily mean that you are subject to U.S. tax on your rental income. You may be eligible for certain tax exemptions or deductions based on the U.S.-Canada Tax Treaty and other relevant tax laws. It is recommended that you consult with a tax professional to determine your specific tax obligations and options. Required documentation. To apply for a USA Tax Identification Number, TIN, non-resident owners of rental property in Canada will need to provide certain documentation. The following documents are typically required: a completed Form W-7, application for IRS Individual Taxpayer Identification Number, a valid passport or other identifying documentation, a foreign tax identification number if applicable, a copy of the rental agreement or lease agreement for the Canadian property, a copy of the property title or deed. In addition to these documents, non-resident owners may also need to provide additional documentation depending on their specific situation. For example, if the property is owned by a corporation, the corporation's articles of incorporation may need to be provided. It is important to note that all documentation must be provided in English or be accompanied by a certified English translation. Failure to provide the necessary documentation or provide it in the correct format may result in delays or rejection of the TIN application. Non-resident owners should also be prepared to wait several weeks for their TIN application to be processed by the IRS. It is recommended that owners submit their application well in advance of any tax filing deadlines to ensure that they have their TIN in time to file their taxes. Filing your application. To apply for a USA Tax Identification Number, TIN, as a non-resident owner of a rental property in Canada, there are several steps that need to be taken. The following paragraphs will outline the process of filing your application. Firstly, you will need to complete Form W-7, which is the application for IRS Individual Taxpayer Identification Number. This form can be downloaded from the IRS website or obtained from a local IRS office. Once you have completed the form, you will need to gather the necessary supporting documents. These may include a valid passport, a copy of your Canadian tax return, and proof of your rental income and expenses. You may also need to provide additional documentation depending on your specific situation. After you have gathered all the necessary documents, you can submit your application to the IRS. You can do this by mailing your completed Form W-7 and supporting documents to the IRS ITIN Operations Department, or by making an appointment at a local IRS office to submit your application in person. It is important to note that the processing time for a TIN application can vary depending on the volume of applications received by the IRS. It is recommended that you apply for your TIN well in advance of any tax filing deadlines to ensure that you have enough time to receive your TIN and file your tax return on time. In conclusion, obtaining a TIN as a non-resident owner of a rental property in Canada requires completing Form W7, gathering the necessary supporting documents, and submitting your application to the IRS. It is important to apply well in advance of any tax filing deadlines to ensure that you have enough time to receive your TIN and file your tax return on time. What to do after receiving your tax identification number? Once you have received your tax identification number, TIN, you can start filing your tax returns. As a non-resident owning a rental property in Canada, you will need to file a Canadian tax return every year to report your rental income. It is important to keep accurate records of all your rental income and expenses throughout the year. This will help you to accurately report your income and claim deductions on your tax return. You can use accounting software or hire an accountant to help you keep track of your finances. When filing your tax return, you will need to include your TIN on the form. If you have any questions or concerns about filing your tax return, you can contact the Canada Revenue Agency, CRA, for assistance. In addition to filing your Canadian tax return, you may also need to file a tax return in the United States if you are a US citizen or resident. This will depend on your individual circumstances, so it is important to consult with a tax professional to determine your tax obligations in both Canada and the United States. Overall, obtaining a TIN is an important step in owning a rental property in Canada as a non-resident. With accurate record keeping and the assistance of a tax professional, you can ensure that you are fulfilling your tax obligations and maximizing your deductions. Maintaining compliance with U.S. tax laws. As a non-resident who owns a rental property in Canada, it is important to maintain compliance with U.S. tax laws. Failure to do so can result in penalties, fines, and even legal action. One of the key requirements for non-resident owners of rental properties in Canada is to obtain a U.S. tax identification number, TIN. This number is used to identify the owner for tax purposes and is required for filing tax returns with the Internal Revenue Service, IRS. In addition to obtaining a TIN, non-resident owners of rental properties in Canada must also ensure that they are reporting their rental income and expenses accurately on their U.S. tax returns. This includes reporting any rental income received from tenants, as well as any expenses related to the maintenance and upkeep of the property. It is also important to keep accurate records of all rental income and expenses, as well as any other financial transactions related to the property. This will help ensure that the owner is able to provide the necessary documentation and information in the event of an audit or other tax-related inquiry. Overall, maintaining compliance with U.S. tax laws is essential for non-resident owners of rental properties in Canada. By obtaining a TIN, accurately reporting rental income and expenses, and keeping accurate records, owners can avoid potential penalties and legal action and ensure that they are meeting their tax obligations in the United States. Seeking professional assistance. For non-residents who are unfamiliar with the tax laws of the United States and Canada, seeking professional assistance is highly recommended. A tax professional who is familiar with the tax laws of both countries can provide valuable guidance and advice on how to obtain a USA tax identification number. A tax professional can also help non-residents understand their tax obligations in both countries, including how to report rental income from a property in Canada on their U.S. tax return. They can also provide guidance on how to apply for any tax treaty benefits that may be available to reduce the amount of tax owed. When seeking professional assistance, it is important to choose a reputable and experienced tax professional who is knowledgeable about the tax laws in both countries. This can include a certified public accountant, CPA, or an enrolled agent, EA, who specializes in international tax. Overall, seeking professional assistance can help non-residents navigate the complex tax laws of the United States and Canada and ensure that they are in compliance with all applicable tax laws. Conclusion. In conclusion, obtaining a U.S. tax identification number as a non-resident who owns a rental property in Canada is a straightforward process. By completing the necessary forms and providing the required documentation, non-residents can obtain an ITIN or EIN from the IRS. It is important to note that the process may take some time, and it is recommended to begin the application process well in advance of the tax filing deadline. Additionally, it may be helpful to consult with a tax professional or seek guidance from the IRS if there are any questions or concerns about the application process. Once a non-resident has obtained a U.S. tax identification number, they can use it to file taxes on their rental income in the United States and take advantage of any applicable tax treaties between the U.S. and Canada. By staying informed and taking the necessary steps to comply with tax laws, non-residents can successfully navigate the process of owning a rental property in Canada as a non-resident. Need help obtaining your U.S. TIN? Call 416-283-8774 or visit theaccountingandtax.com.